This case was featured in the June-July 2019 edition of the Australian-based UFO Encounter magazine, issue 305. While it's not as splashy as some other cases I cover, I did find one aspect to be intriguing. I'll explain later. 1977, either September or October. The witness was not able to recall the exact date. He also asked that his name not be used, though for the sake of the story I'm just going to call him Dale. I just find it's easier that way and a lot better than saying the witness over and over again. Anyway, on the night in question, Dale was attempting to sleep in the back seat of his friend's car, which was parked on the street outside his friend's parents' house in Armadale, Western Australia. Dale did not elaborate on how he came to find himself in this predicament, sleeping in his friend's car in front of a house on a lonely, dark street, only that it would be the setting for a bizarre and chilling experience he would later endure. The house was built on the southern side of Mount Nasura, and the street level was higher than the house, so by peering over its roof, he had an unobstructed view of the opposite hilltop, which was mostly undeveloped, tree-covered land. At around 2 a.m., uncomfortable and unable to sleep, Dale reached around to his rear shelf for his cigarettes. As he did this, his attention was immediately drawn to a bright, bluish-white light, suspended just above the opposite hilltop. It was not a static light, but one that swung from side to side, not unlike a pendulum. Dale recalled that it would flash at the end of each swinging arc, leaving a trace as it swung back the other way, flash, then track back the other way, and so on. He could plainly see the trees illuminated on the top of the hill by the light's back and forth motion, so he was able to determine that it was not something many miles away in the distance. Its distance from his viewpoint, he guessed, would have been approximately 1,000 yards. He should have been close enough to hear any kind of sound made by it, if it had indeed been any type of known aircraft, such as a helicopter. Yet it was completely silent. There was no aircraft of any sort that Dale knew of existing in 1977 like this. He simply could not understand what this thing was. I sat transfixed staring at this thing, not daring to move. My spine tingled and my every rational sense told me that this was something not of this world, and I was very, very frightened. I felt that if there was something intelligent in control of this thing, then it must have been able to see me sitting there like a stunned rabbit in a spotlight. I never did have that cigarette, and I have no recollection of either the light going away or my lying down and going to sleep. However, I must have at some point gone to sleep, because I do remember suddenly waking up in daylight, sitting bolt upright and looking immediately over at the opposite hilltop to see if the thing was still there, and if there was some kind of structure over there that I'd never noticed before. There was nothing out of the ordinary. It was exactly the same as I had seen it plenty of times before in daylight, just patches of grass and the trees. Dale was quite certain, given the time of the morning, he would have been the only person to have seen the strange light. I often think about this event, and although it's more than 40 years ago, I can recall it as clearly as if it happened yesterday. What had hitherto puzzled me a little about it, and still puzzles me now, is that the memory is in two distinct halves. One half of it is sitting in petrified fear, watching this thing swinging back and forth, and the other half is of suddenly waking up face down on the back seat, in daylight, and immediately looking over at the hilltop. There is nothing separating those two memories. One moment I was sitting up and wide awake, and the next moment I was waking up very suddenly from sleep. No dreams, nothing. All I knew was that there was a period of several hours that I couldn't account for, other than being asleep for part of that time. Now this is where I find myself revisiting the event, more than 40 years later, and now with a somewhat alarming thought that had not occurred to me before. In the years since his encounter, Dale watched some documentaries pertaining to the UFO subject, most notably one detailing former British police officer Alan Godfrey's weird UFO experience in 1980. The similarity between his experience and mine is startling. One moment he was sitting in his police car looking at this strange object in front of him, and an instant later, or so it seemed to him, he was driving away from the scene with a 45-minute portion of time unaccounted for. Fortunately for him and his reputation, other policemen also saw the phenomenon from different locations in and around the Suffolk town of Todmorden, and their descriptions of its behavior, the side-to-side motion, seemed to be very similar to the one that I saw 3 years earlier in Western Australia. I am now seriously considering the possibility that the same thing happened to me. Was I taken from the parked car, subjected to scrutiny, then put back in the car in an unconscious state afterwards? And if nothing of the sort happened at all, what else could possibly explain the crucial chunk of missing memory? Did I imagine it all? No, I didn't imagine it. It was real. I saw it, and something very strange happened to me as a result of seeing it. As with so many cases, Dale's experience was ushered in by the sighting of a light that seemed to swing back and forth, similar to a pendulum. He continued to watch it until, well, something happened and he found himself back in his friend's car, asleep. It's interesting the detail about the light moving like a pendulum. Who hasn't seen an old movie where some white-haired elderly fellow is swinging his pocket watch back and forth like a pendulum in order to hypnotize a patient? You're getting very sleepy. Pendulums are indeed used by some hypnotists to place patients into an altered state of consciousness, and that seems to be what happened here. Dale has no memory of seeing the craft fly away, nor does he recall getting back in the car. Just one moment he's looking at the craft moving back and forth, and the next, he's picking himself up off the seat of his friend's car, almost as if he'd been hypnotized. Dale speculated that he had been taken, based on the unaccounted for time between watching and waking up, the two distinct halves of a single moment, though he came to this conclusion only after he further familiarized himself with the UFO phenomenon, and noticed how his experience was consistent with other people who believed that they had been taken, like former police officer Alan Godfrey. Even his description of feeling like a bunny in a spotlight is similar to what was described by Barney Hill under hypnosis. I do not see this knowledge of other cases as influencing Dale. Rather, I believe it just provided examples for which he could compare his experience to, examples that, 200 years ago, would not have existed beyond spooky chatter around a fireplace on a windy night. I wonder how many people throughout history have observed an odd light on a hillside or in the woods, only to later experience a noticeable jump in time. How many of them just shrugged it off as a dream or as an odd experience? Thankfully, due to the hard work of early and current paranormal and UFO researchers and this amazing little thing called the internet, we are able to pull together these missing pieces of a mystery, which we are only beginning to conceive of. Dale himself expressed an interest in regression therapy in order to possibly uncover what might have occurred in that period of missing time. There's a lot of similarities with the New Zealand case I covered a couple of videos ago, and how the UFO was able to switch off the people. It also brings to mind another one I covered a while back, the Castro Valley case, where the guy was with his girlfriend and they saw a UFO. They decided to drive up this hill and come up on it, and as they were doing this, his girlfriend, who was in the passenger seat, she was talking and she just suddenly stopped talking like mid-sentence. He looked over and noticed that she was in a sort of like trance. Later, as he drove away from the object, I guess he got close to it and he got kind of spooked, and he decided to turn around and go back down the hill. And as he did so, she started speaking again, picking up exactly where she had left off, like she had been switched back on. I always find it interesting, these types of cases where the visitors are seemingly able to switch eyewitnesses on and off like a machine, like a robot. It does seem as though somehow Dale was indeed switched off, and later, after a period of time, switched back on again for whatever reason. This brings me to another case that I would like to talk about. It's similar but a little different, a little more frightening, at least to me. It was covered in the 1983 edition of the UFO Sverige Ekul, number 3. It's a newsletter. It was also covered in the 1984 Nordic UFO newsletter, issue 1. Make of it what you will. It was 1:30 a.m., Friday, July 22nd, 1983. Bolarp, Halland, Sweden. Urban Sawstrom, a farmer, had gone out to feed his 2 horses some extra food since the very dry summer had spoiled access to the pasture. He was a bit of a night owl, so going out at that time really wasn't out of the ordinary for him. It was a mild, calm evening, and the sky appeared to be cloud-free. It should have been a fairly uneventful trip to the barn. Sadly, it was anything but. As he stood rationing out the hay to the 2 horses, his attention was suddenly drawn to a nearby pasture. A strong light appeared to be illuminating the area. He looked up for the source and observed a shining ball the size of a full moon slowly descending down over the field. He could not determine the altitude. Just then, Sawstrom watched as his 2 horses laid down on the ground, almost as if they had been given a tranquilizer. He had owned one of the horses for 6 years, and not once had he seen him lay down on the ground, so he found the behavior particularly odd. Around this time, Sawstrom realized that something was wrong with him. He couldn't move. From his shoulders down, he couldn't move at all. Sawstrom became quite frightened, as the only thing he wanted to do was run away. Instead, he could only stand and watch the lighted ball. And this is when things took an even stranger turn. Exactly how long I was standing there, I don't know. I only know that when the paralysis finally set me free, I ran to the house screaming to wake up my wife, Karen. As he ran, Sawstrom noticed that his shoes, some wooden old clogs, were completely gone. He had only his socks on, which he couldn't understand. He could not recall taking them off, nor did he believe that they fell off when he ran. They were just gone. Sawstrom's wife, still dazed from sleep, ran outside to check on her husband. She saw him running toward her. She also saw the shining ball hovering above a nearby field of oats. Sawstrom ran up to his wife, standing in his stocking feet. Both were shocked and confused. While they stood talking and watching the strange object, Karen discovered that both her bracelet and necklace had disappeared from her body without a trace. She had been wearing both when she went to bed. In fact, she wore them day and night for years, but now both items were missing. The Sawstroms ran to a neighbor's house which was next door, but despite knocking on their door frantically, the family didn't rouse until the shining ball had left. The neighbors didn't much believe the Sawstrom story about a UFO. Urban returned to his house and dialed up a military station in the neighborhood, and was informed that no radar had been activated in the area. Urban Sawstrom's bizarre case received some media attention in Sweden, and he even did a handful of interviews in which his story never changed. Another man, Larry Aberg from Alingus, came forward to the newspapers after Sawstrom's sighting began making the rounds. He wanted to report what he and his father saw on the night of July 22nd, the same night, while they were out fishing on Lake Morin. At around 2 a.m., Larry's father suddenly spotted a, quote, an unusually long and magnificent shooting star. 30 minutes later, a strange ball appeared in the sky. It was a little less than the full moon in size and had a shining aura around itself, Larry told reporters. The ball slowly descended below some trees, rose again, and disappeared rapidly towards the south. After the ball disappeared, Larry and his father determined that it would be a good idea to pack it in. When they went to start the boat engine, they found it was barely able to function. It ran irregular and coughed all the way back to the shore. Even though it was recently renovated and had been working perfectly only an hour earlier, it now seemed ready for the trash heap. The next day, Larry and his father checked the engine and found that it worked fine. Coincidence? Or did that strange object affect the engine's ability to function properly? Investigators noted that Larry Aberg's description of the UFO seemed to be in accordance with Urban's description, despite the sightings happening almost 125 miles apart. Was this a case of two similar-looking objects being sighted on the same night, around the same time, in the same country? Or had Sawstrom and Aberg seen the same craft as it zipped about at speeds us humans couldn't even imagine? I'm less inclined to believe that it might have been the same one, if only because of the sheer strangeness that happened to Urban and Karen Sawstrom. Or was something else going on? Urban estimated that he had gone out to the barn at around 1:30 a.m., whereupon he had his sighting and the horses laid down. He became paralyzed. His next conscious memory was being released from said paralysis and running towards the house. And while he did not reference any gap in time in between those two periods, it could easily be assumed that there was one, given that Urban was barefoot and his wife was missing various items from her person. Clearly something else happened that neither Urban nor his wife could recall. Anyone familiar with David Paulides and his Missing 411 books will no doubt take notice of the detail of Urban's missing shoes. Urban told reporters that he did not remember taking them off, only that he was wearing them one second and the next he wasn't. According to newspapers, Urban eventually did find his shoes nearly 300 feet from the field with the horses. It looked like I'd placed them there myself, he recalled. How they got there, Urban had no idea. Karen, by all accounts, was inside the house sleeping and was not even aware of the UFO until she had been called outside, though it was at this point she discovered her necklace and bracelet were gone. This brings to mind fairy lore, in which they are said to make off with people's possessions, only to return them at a later date, or sometimes not. Curiously, Karen did indeed find the necklace sitting on the table inside the house. The bracelet, however, has never been found. So all this happened around 1:30 a.m. Aberg and his father, out fishing 125 miles away at around 2 a.m., saw a similar object which may or may not have affected their boat's engine. If indeed the visitors had done something to Mr. and Mrs. Sawstrom, which it certainly sounds like they did, and they then zipped away to be seen by the Abergs, then they must have had a very limited window of time to do it, unless time works differently for them. Further, they had to have returned later to place the shoes in the field and the necklace on the table. All this begs the question, why? Why did the object linger about before departing, just before the Sawstroms were able to rouse the neighbors who ultimately doubted their story? It's like the visitors are always 10 steps ahead. By allowing the Sawstroms to see their craft, they allowed the couple to confirm their existence, but they departed just in time to make them seem crazy when they attempted to tell somebody. It's as if the visitors are saying, "You know what we are, you know we exist, but if you try to tell anybody, they'll just say you're crazy."